All right, we are 1 minute away. I've asked Arko to start sharing his slides for the second paper. So the paper is a paper about firm boundaries and political uncertainty. And this is done using state elections in India. So a similar paper looking at elections, but a very different setting when we're looking at India. Arko Sarkar from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology will present the paper, and Sumit Agarwal from NUS will discuss it afterwards. Arko?
So this paper studies the relationship between political uncertainty and firms varying in their organization structure. So the motivation of the paper stems from the fact that uncertainty surrounding government policies has been one of the major concerns of CEOs and CFOs across the world. And this has been reflected in many of the works or studies by, say, surveys conducted by PwC, Duke University's CFO Global Outlook have identified political uncertainty as one of the major concerns for the global leaders across the world. And even in the context of India, the former RBI governor had said that a potential additional source of uncertainty is the general elections, and a stable new government would be positive for the economy. And in this context, there has been an increased interest to study the impact of policy-related uncertainty on firm performances. And we can see that reflected in the academic articles as well, as has been documented by Julio Uke, Baker, Bloom, and Davis, in the way that they have identified the impact of political or policy uncertainty on firms' decision-making. And there are many other papers that have tried to do so as well. However, there are very limited studies that have identified attributes that makes a certain kind of firms more vulnerable to policy-related uncertainty. That is, what are the characteristics of firms that make it more affected by political uncertainty or policy-related uncertainty? And in this paper, I attempt to study the relationship between political uncertainty and organizational form. More specifically, I asked the question whether standalone firms are more sensitive to political uncertainty than firms belonging to a larger conglomerate. So whether firms that are single segment standalones, whether they have a different exposure to political uncertainty than another subsidiary, a similar subsidiary, but it's a part of a business group or a group of conglomerates. Now, there is a long-standing literature between conglomerates and standalone firms, and there has been like a lot of debates about the costs and benefits of being a part of a larger conglomerate or a conglomerate organizational structure. So the benefits include internal capital market, centralized controls, and debt coinsurance, among others, while the costs are increased agency cost, increased inefficient resource allocation, corporate socialism, and so many other inefficient allocations within the organizational structure. So this has been the debates around the costs and benefits within the conglomerate structure. And in US, often we have seen like talks of discounts within conglomerate, that there exists a conglomerate discount. Even in recent literature, they have been inconclusive about conglomerate firms' performance during shocks like competition, crisis, shocks to investment opportunity, and so on. So I specifically asked the question whether there is any difference in borrowing or investment of conglomerates and standalones for firms during periods of elevated political uncertainty, or if there is a shock to political uncertainty, is there any difference between the way that firms leverage or their cost of capital is affected, which is different from standalones and conglomerates. Now, what are the possible channels through which such effect can manifest itself? One is the demand channel. And the way that it can affect is, we know that during periods of uncertainty that there is high option value of weighting, and the option value of weighting increases during periods of uncertainty because firms want to wait this period of uncertainty out, and so there's a zone of inaction. However, such option values can be different from for standalones and conglomerate firms, because they can have different periods of waiting time before they want to take up investments, and before they think that the uncertainty has resolved itself. And this can lead to different demand for investment, and thereby consequently different demand for debt by these particular firms. The other potential impact can come from the supply channel, that is the access to capital channel, where banks supply different level of capital to conglomerate and standalone firms. The reason could be due to different perceived riskiness of these particular firms. Banks can consider standalones to be more risky than conglomerates, or even given the existing literature, banks could have considered conglomerates even to be more risky than standalones. I'm just saying that there could be difference in perceived riskiness, or there could be difference in connections or political connections of these two firms, which might enable them to access capital during such periods of uncertainty. Again, like this could be different for standalones and conglomerate firms. So I particularly try and understand which of these channels dominate my results during these periods of uncertainty. So I should be upfront, and I should say that I'm not very clear to separate this out, but I'll try to provide evidence about which of these two channels will dominate the results that I'm going to find. Now, before going in more detail, let me just give you a brief preview of the results. So the main finding of the paper is that borrowing decreases for standalone firms compared to conglomerate firms during periods of uncertainty. I find that the decline is primarily in the short-term debt. The reason being is that the short-term debt is likely to be rolled over during periods when the uncertainty is not yet resolved, while long-term debt are going to be rolled over for a longer period when the uncertainty has been resolved. So if I have to find any impact in the debt, the premise is that I should find the more effect in the shorter term debt, and that is what I find in the results as well. The next thing that I find is that the borrowing cost increases, particularly for standalone firms compared to conglomerate firms. Now, this opposite movement of the quantity and price, that is the quantity going down and price going up, reflects a shift in the supply curve. There could be shift in the demand curve as well, but the opposite movement reflects that the supply shifts more than the demand, and the effect probably is driven by supply side factors. Now, the decline in borrowing, I find, is that it is lower for standalones that has lower borrowing constraints. Given that the primary finding of the paper tells that it is the supply bottlenecks that is giving this, leading to this different effect of standalones and conglomerate firms, I find that the decline in debt of the standalone firms is lower for the firms that have lesser borrowing constraint. And finally, I show that there is high distortions in capital allocation. I'll go ahead and talk about it in more detail, that how do I measure these distortions. It says that it's not just difference in the optimal debt that the firm has, and that is what is getting reflected in the results, but it is some form of misallocation happening during these periods of uncertainty, and misallocations are particularly more directed towards standalone firms. And finally, I show that all of this is reflected in the investment outcome of the firms as well. That is, investments goes down for standalone compared to conglomerate firms. So the brief outline for the remainder of the talk is that I'll give you an institutional background followed by the data. Then I'll highlight some identification challenges that are there in this literature of studying any difference between conglomerate and standalones, following which I'll show you some results. And if I have time, I'll go through some cross-sectional tests and robustness checks. So let me start with the institutional background. So the main institutional background is talking about the political system in India. So India has a federal structure with elections held both at national and state levels. It's almost like US, where you have both federal and gubernatorial elections. Now, elections are staggered across states, which helps me with my identification. So each state follows its own 5-year cycle. Now, different states can also hold elections at different months in the same year, unlike, say, the gubernatorial elections, which holds election only in, say, November of a particular year. And elections can be called early if the assembly is dissolved. Now, I particularly do away with such elections because, like the timing of the elections, if it changes, that can have many endogeneity concerns that why were these elections changed and so on. So I use only the elections whose date was fixed from before. And elections in India at the constituency level follows the first past the post system, with candidates securing the maximum valid votes winning the elections, and the political party or the coalition, which has 50% of the constituencies, goes ahead and forms the government. So this is just the brief description of the political system that is followed in India. And this is just a map showing that the elections are staggered across the region. So it's not that the elections which happens in a year are cluttered in the same geographic area. So it's spread across the country as well. And now to talk about the conglomerate organizational forms in India. So conglomerates are called business groups in India, and the affiliate of a business group are legally independent entities. So each affiliate has a separate board of directors. They independently develop and execute their own strategies, policies, and so on. And it creates its own incentives for the managers. It's just that they are under the umbrella of one big conglomerate structure. So, however, the core owners who may hold large equity interest in the affiliated companies directly participate in overseeing the CEOs, functional heads, or board members. And just to borrow a term from one of the largest conglomerate heads of India, who is Anand Mahindra, the conglomerates in India operates like a federation of companies that each individual subsidiary has its own operation. It performs individually. However, they are under the umbrella of the bigger firm. So this is what I'll use as how conglomerate operate and how it's different from standalone firms. Now to talk briefly about the data. So the firm information, I have subsidiary level information from a database called Prowess in India. So we use non-banking and non-financial firms for the purpose of this study, which is quite standard in this literature. So to classify firms as being a part of a group, I use this database's itself classification, which classifies each subsidiary, whether it's a part of conglomerate or whether it's not a part of conglomerate. And this classification has been used earlier by Bertrand Mehta and Mulainathan, Gopalananda and Seru in their works of conglomerate structures in India. So I use the same classification for identifying whether a firm is a part of a conglomerate or whether it's a standalone firm. Now, elections. So the timing of the elections are available from the Elections Commission on India. And I also corroborate my analysis from data on lending and interest from one large private bank in India. So this is like a subsidiary evidence that I provide to my main findings using data from one particular bank. Now, let me highlight some of the identification challenges that can affect my findings. So one of this, so the literature have used national elections as events of high political uncertainty. However, if one uses national elections, what you'll have to do, you will have to compare a conglomerate and a standalone directly with themselves during periods of elections vis-a-vis periods of vis-a-vis other periods. However, conglomerates and standalones can be two different beasts altogether. They can be very different from each other. And so using such one-shot event like national elections could be a problem because you're not being able to compare apples for apples. And this would also allow, because you're not comparing two identical firms, it could have a different, you would not be able to separate time trends from the actual impact. So what I use as a possible solution is the state elections. So state elections are staggered across time. So staggered state election, it allows me to compare standalone firms in a treated state, that is a state which has imminent election, vis-a-vis a control state that is a state which does not have any upcoming election, and compare the difference with a set of conglomerates or a subsidiary of conglomerate between the same treated and controlled state. So essentially what I'm ending up doing is a triple difference regressions where I'm controlling a treated and a controlled state before and after the elections, and the difference between the standalone and conglomerate in the treated and controlled state as well. So we are not directly having to compare the standalone and conglomerates, but we are comparing standalones with the standalone in a treated and controlled state, and a conglomerate with another conglomerate in the treated and controlled state, with the treated state being the state which has an upcoming elections. Yeah, so and the state government in India has also important policy tools under its disposal, which the firms actually care about. Because one could say that, like state governments elections has nothing to do with firms. And to just give you an example, like transport, communication, public law, labor markets, property rights, and many others are under these all powers are under the disposal of the state government and not the national government, and this would definitely have an effect on firms' decision making. And for example, Gujarat, which is one of the largest states in India, recently passed a series of labor law reforms, making it difficult for some of the workers to go on strike. And these kind of laws, which are passed by states, can definitely have an impact on firms' decision making. Yeah, so let me now talk about my empirical strategy. So the baseline empirical specifications take the following form. So I regress my primary dependent variable, which can be investments, debt, capital and output distortion, on the main variable of interest, which is the interaction between elections and the standalone dummy. That is a dummy variable, which takes one when a firm doesn't belong to any conglomerate structure. So election is the dummy that takes a value 1 if a state S has election in the next period. So I consider the period just prior to election as the period of uncertainty. Standalone again is the dummy which takes a value 1 when there is no when it's not a part of any conglomerate structure. Now what I do is to differentiate between more uncertain and less uncertain election, with the idea being that you always can predict election, but it's difficult to predict. So you can predict, like, because the election timing is given, when the election is going to come, but the uncertainty arises from the fact that one might not be able to cleanly say which exactly the political party who is going to win, and I proxy that by whether the elections are more uncertain and less uncertain, and I run the same regression by splitting the elections between more uncertain elections and less uncertain elections, with the more uncertain elections being defined as those elections where the difference between the winner and the runner-up were less than 5% of the total number of constituencies that were up for grabs. Okay, so if I have to so before going into my regression specifications and results, if I have to summarize my findings, so this is the main finding of the paper. So the dotted blue line represents the standalone firms, and the red line represents the conglomerate firms, with 0 being the period of high election uncertainty, and the x-axis represents an entire election cycle, that is 2 years before the election, the periods of election uncertainty, and the 2 years after election. So this is the 5-year election cycle. I use the 2 years before election as the omitted time period, and with regards to this, I see what is the effect of the debt to asset ratio of standalone and conglomerate firms. I do not find any impact on the conglomerate firms, which is represented by the red line. However, I see that the debt to asset ratio of the standalone firms drops sharply during the periods of high election uncertainty. I do not find any difference between standalone and conglomerate firms in any other periods, but for the period of high uncertainty, giving me the giving some idea that the effect is coming during the periods of uncertainty, and it's coming from the fact that the standalone firms are reducing their debt during these periods of uncertainty, and conglomerate firms are largely getting unaffected. So let me just show you the results now. So the first result talks about the impact of debt to asset ratio, and the main variable of interest is standalone times election. And I find that during these periods, the debt to asset ratio goes down by around 80 basis points, which is not that large. However, if you see the effect that happens during periods of more uncertain elections, so the debt to asset ratio goes down by 2.7 percentage points. And given that the average debt to asset ratio for a standalone firms is roughly around 32-33%, the effect is around 8 percentage decline in the debt to asset ratio, or in the leverage ratio, during periods of more uncertain elections. However, I do not find any effect during periods of less uncertain elections, giving me the idea that the effect is coming primarily from the uncertainty aspect of elections, and not through some other factor that can also affect during periods of, say, just during the election cycle effect. And all the regressions are controlling are compared across standalones within the same compared across standalones across the states between the control and treatment within the same industry. And also they're compared, like a standalone is compared to a conglomerate within the same state, within the same industry. So this is how the identification comes, because I use a state industry time fixed effects and a firm structure industry time fixed effects in my regressions. So next I show the results on bank loan to asset ratio, because a large section of the debt in most of the Indian companies comes from the bank loan to asset ratio. And I find largely similar effect. And the effect is around 2 percentage point reduction in bank loan to asset ratio. And given the bank loan being roughly around 25% or 20 to 25%, this roughly indicates around 10% decline in the bank's loan to asset ratio. Next, I look at the difference between short-term and long-term debt. And as I was saying, if I had to expect any effect coming in the debt ratios, I would have expected it to come in the short-term debt, because these are of lower maturity and are supposed to be rolled over or repaid before the election uncertainty is completely resolved. So I find, and in line with that, I find the effect to be primarily coming from short-term debt to asset ratio. And next, I look at the interest rate. So I do not have the exact interest rate variable. So what I do is I use interest expenses to debt as a proxy for interest rate. And I find that again, during periods of more uncertain election, I find roughly around 1 percentage point increase in the interest rate. Again, like the average interest rate for a standalone firm is roughly around 12%. And so the effect implies roughly around a 9 percentages increase in the interest rate of these particular types of firms, that is the standalone firms. So now, given these results, as I was saying before, that the quantity of borrowing goes down and the price of borrowing goes up, indicates that the effect is driven primarily from the reduced supply of capital than the reduced demand for it. Because if the effect would be driven only by the demand, you would have observed a shift in demand curve, and that would imply that both the price and the quantity would have gone down. Now, given that we see the quantity to go down, however, the price is going up, it implies a shift in the supply curve as well, and most likely the supply shift to be stronger than any potential shift in the demand for these loans. Now, I'm just plotting a dynamic difference in difference coefficients across the same election cycle of the debt to asset ratio and the interest rate. And again, I find a decline in the debt to asset ratio during the periods of high uncertainty, and a rise in the interest rate again during this periods of high election uncertainty. So this is just like the same regression, but now I look at over the time period just to show that there is no some kind of pre-trend that is happening before the elections, and there is no difference that exists before the elections in itself. Now let me show you some results that looks at the borrowing constraint and how borrowing constraint can mitigate the effect in the standalone firms. So the way that one of the ways that I measure borrowing constraint is the number of relationship that a particular firm has with the bank. So I use so the number of banks that a particular firm is connected to, and if a firm is connected to more number of banks, then I classify those firms to have lesser borrowing constraint. And if you see the first column, the first and the second row, I find that during more uncertain elections, the bank loan goes down, as we had seen before. However, as the number of relationship goes up, the decrease in the bank's borrowing is somewhat mitigated. So though this borrowing goes down, but as a firm has more number of relationship borrowers or relationship banks, those firms has a lesser reduction in the debt. So some of the reduction in the borrowing is mitigated if a firm has more number of relationship, or a standalone firm has more number of relationship, highlighting that the effect is higher for firms that have a higher borrowing constraint. Alternatively, I measure borrowing constraint that has been largely used in the literature as like tangibility, like the more tangible resources that a firm has, the more collateralizable their assets are, and the higher loan they can take. And I find that the effect is primarily in the low tangible firms and lesser effect in the high tangible firms, suggesting that it's particularly in those cases where the borrowing constraint is tighter, the effect of standalone firms is much more than the conglomerate firms. Next, I try to look at the capital and output distortions that can potentially happen during periods of uncertainty. So for measuring distortions, I use an off-the-shelf model from Hayes and Klenau. So they use a Melitz model, but using a distortion parameter in their profit maximizing function. So if you see, the profit maximizing function is the same with just a tau y parameter, which is called as output distortion, and a tau k parameter, which is called the capital distortion. And according to Hayes and Klenau, tau y, which is the output distortion, would be high for firms that face government restriction on size or high transport costs. So this is like a broad restriction imposed on the firms, while capital distortion, that is tau k, which is measured as the difference between the amount of capital that a firm receives and its marginal productivity. So the idea is, in the absence of any restriction, the marginal productivity of capital across all the firms would be equalized. However, in the presence of distortion, there will be one firm with a higher level of marginal productivity, which has not yet been equalized with their interest expenses, because a higher level of marginal productivity in an ideal scenario would mean that more capital would flow towards that particular firm, leading to lowering of their marginal productivity to equate with their interest expense. However, any distortion that doesn't equate the marginal productivity with the interest expense is measured as capital distortion. And according again to Hayes and Klenau, capital distortion would be high for firms that do not have access to credit. So if the effect that I find comes particularly from the supply side distortion, I would have expected that tau k particularly would be higher for standalone firms during periods of high uncertainty. And that is exactly what I find, that during periods of more uncertain election, capital distortion is higher. However, I do not find much evidence in output distortion, providing another evidence that it is the supply side bottleneck that is possibly driving the results. And finally, I look at the capex, which is the investments, and I find lower capital expenditure by the standalone firms, particularly during the periods of more uncertain elections. Now, let me talk about some cross-sectional tests. So first, I want to understand which feature of the conglomerate firms actually makes it less vulnerable compared to standalone firms. And the way I do it is one of the features of being a part of conglomerate is its internal capital market backing, right? So the backing that a particular smaller standalone firm can have from another of its a smaller subsidiary of a conglomerate can have from another larger subsidiary, which is more cash rich. So the idea of the test is that when this largest subsidiary is also having an election, there is lesser bandwidth for this larger subsidiary to provide any support for the smaller subsidiaries. I would have expected more impact on the smaller subsidiaries of a conglomerate when a larger subsidiary is free to provide support to this smaller subsidiary, and less effect when this larger subsidiary itself has an imminent election to face. And that is what I find, that if there is no election in the larger subsidiary, then I find the effect is much stronger. However, if there is any effect in the larger subsidiary, that is, the larger subsidiary itself is having an imminent election, then I do not find any particular effect that one would expect. And similarly, I find the effect is much stronger during periods of more uncertain election compared to periods of less uncertain elections. Now, so what this test highlights is that just the fact that you have or a subsidiary of a conglomerate has a backing from a larger conglomerate is what is providing them the safety net during this periods of election compared to conglomerate firms.
Arko, you have 2 more minutes.
Okay, I'll wrap up quickly. Yeah, and then there are other features of conglomerates that one would think might provide it benefit, like it's diverse across industries and diverse across states. However, I do not find much effect coming from just the diversification across states and across industries, as is reflected from the industry regression, where both conglomerates with more diverse industries and less diverse industries are equally affected. Similarly, as conglomerates with more diverse, operating in more and less number of states, are also equally affected. Yeah. So just to summarize this set of cross-sectional tests, I find the effect particularly driven in the conglomerates from the fact that they have an internal capital backup from this large subsidiaries. Now, I do a lot other robustness checks, which I'll probably skip for the time constraint. And so I'll just go ahead and conclude. So what the paper shows is that there is a cross-sectional heterogeneity based on organizational form in firms' response to political uncertainty. The results suggest that standalone firms are relatively more impacted by political uncertainty. The opposite movement, coupled with the distortion in the capital allocation, highlights a shortage of supply driving the effect. Now, in conclusion, while a large section of existing literature points to some form of conglomerate discount, this paper highlights a bright side. That is, particularly during the periods of elevated uncertainty, all the family of the conglomerates come together and protect that particular another firm which has this imminent election. So yeah, that is what the paper is about. And thank you.
Thank you, Arko. Sumit will discuss the paper. Sumit?
So thank you. I have no slides, mainly because last week, Arko and I had a 1-hour discussion about the paper. So we went over it almost slide by slide. So I thought no reason for me to waste my time and the audience time, and Arko will benefit more so by getting comments from everybody here than just me. I will make some comments on the paper, but I will let some of my time go so that the audience can ask him and push him at this point on his paper. So the big picture, or the things that I really like about this paper, is what ARCO has done in terms of the identification challenge. Typically in this kind of paper, you will get stuck, look, you're comparing conglomerates versus standalone firms, and they are not apples to apples comparison, and you have this identification of election. So as ARCO spent a lot of time on the identification challenge and how he tries to overcome that, I think that's very nice, very cool what he does and how he kind of overcomes that. I think that's the main thing that allows him to have this paper then go through. From a big picture point of view, what I take away is, you have a big family. The big family is always fighting all the time, but in bad times, the big family comes together and they help each other. And that's the way I think of this picture, this paper, that there is the huge literature on conglomerates, always having the dark side of conglomerates. You can think about some empire building literature, or, ARCO pointed out to all the dark side. And this is something where ARCO can say that, look, during bad times, these guys will band together. I mean, I think about, joint families in India. They are always fighting, cousin brothers and cousin sisters, but in bad times, they'll all come help each other out. So that's where I would think about matching this or relating this to some sociology literature on what is happening in terms of how people or companies will come together in this case. Now, let me go through some of the comments I have thought about. I mean, some I have discussed them with ARCO already, but just kind of bring them up again. The channels, ARCO actually has these two supply side channels in his mind. I always think in India, conglomerates actually during election times do help politicians win elections. They pump in money to them. In return, they will get favors either directly through the politician in terms of land allocation, in terms of other things, or through the banking channel. The conglomerates will get cheaper credit or access to credit. And so I think the story ARCO has in mind is the pie gets smaller, maybe. The bank's amount of credit that they're allocating is getting smaller. And so as a result, they have to charge higher interest rate. It's also possible the pie is not getting smaller. The pie size is still the same, but it's being reallocated, the money from standalones to the conglomerates, either to the conglomerates in the same state where the election is happening, or the money is being reallocated by the banks because of the politicians telling them to the conglomerate in another state where the elections are not happening. So, I mean, these are harder things to test. ARCO and I did discuss this point. He may be able to get at that to show if the money is being reallocated to a conglomerate in a separate state, and how will you tease that out? And so, look, this is the mechanism it is working. I think there is also this idea that conglomerates end up spending a lot of money. I mean, I know from my state in India, UP, there where the conglomerates are there, every time there's an election, the politician will knock on the door and say, look, you have to commit X amount of money for my election. And they have no choice but to go out and provide those funds. And who knows then how the pie is made. So I think I would push, ARCO a lot on getting the political economy story nice. If he can't, then punt on it and say, look, there are many mechanisms. I can't separate them out. That's not the point. This is what a lot of the political economy papers do. They say, I can't really figure out what the mechanisms are, but here is a fact. And this is a fact on what happens to conglomerate versus what happens to standalone firms. The one thing I liked is that there's this staggered treatment across states. I think you kind of say, look, I don't want to touch these surprise elections. It would have been nice if you actually showed the results. You're saying there's some endogeneity concerns. Possibly there is, but might as well at least show what happens during those surprise elections. Are the results consistent? Are they opposite? Why are they? And then we can debate, is this endogeneity, or is it because we should expect this kind of result for this surprise election? I think the other thing that you kind of brought up, this idea of Mahindra saying, look, these conglomerates run like a federalism. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I think these guys are very hands-on. These are first generation, most of them first generation, at best second generation owners. And I can't just believe they are like saying, look, we have an arm's length relationship with the, with the manager. I mean, as far as I know few of these people, either in Hyderabad or in Delhi and UP, they are very hands-on. I mean, I just know the Times Group. The final decision to make for the university they were setting up to get even the dean level positions or the provost level positions were all done by the CEO of the Times Group. Whereas, I mean, it's such a big organization. Why are they involved in a university's dean position picking? So I just worry that when you say they are arm's length, I just don't believe that a lot of these guys are arm's length. Why stop in 2015? I mean, clearly you can go much further out to 2020. There are many more interesting things that happened in the last 5 years in terms of elections in India, in terms of what was happening to outcomes of these firms. And BJP already brings its own dynamics to what is happening in terms of elections. As I said, I really like the identification, so I'm not going to go after it. I think that's one of the biggest strengths you guys have. I think this relationship, I like the relationship results that you have, that this relationships helps mitigate the effect that you find. So I was thinking, what is going on there? I mean, is it possible that if the firms know that, why aren't the firms really building the relationship with the banks over time itself? And they should be having a lot of this relationship. So in a repeated game, what I should see is that this effect kind of goes away, because you're finding this over a 20-year period, you're finding this effect to be there in almost in every election cycle. Why aren't the firms learning, these standalone firms, learning from this and the effect? In a dynamic sense, if you tell me that the first election versus the sixth election, the standalone firms, the effect on pricing and quantity actually drops, I would feel more comfortable than saying that these firms are actually learning and they are building more relationship, and they actually do that in response to the uncertainty these elections cause them. The other thing I would think about is, could it be that conglomerates actually realize, so this comes back to the shrinking of the pie versus the shifting of the resources within the pie. I mean, is it possible that the conglomerates are thinking on how to reallocate this money to something else that they need it for, versus the standalones don't have that possibility? And so they have to kind of cut down the supply of money, or the conglomerates are taking away that money from the standalones. So again, I think this is a 2 or 3 issues that I would think you could push the paper more on and see what you get. I mean, I think I've spoken as much as I would have done anyway. So these are my comments. I think it's better for the floor to give you more additional comments on this paper.
Thank you, Sumit. Arko, you want to respond quickly before we turn over the floor?
Yeah, I've already all the comments are very helpful, and I've already got more comments from Sumit as well. But just this idea of separating the connections with other forms of uncertainty per se is very interesting. I would love to do it, but the connections data in India is not like in US, where you get data on PACs and super PAC contribution, where you can establish connections very easily. So that would need some more digging to be done in order to establish how the connections are formed. And in terms of being reallocated, I'll try to look into that, because there's some form of related transactions within conglomerates, and I can see whether these transactions are increasing in the control states. And yeah, all the other points are very well taken. Just one clarification on the data is that I had started this project couple of 1 or 2 years back when I was a PhD student. So I had a dump of prowess data that was still there with me, which was still 2015, but I'm extending it now as well. But thank you for the comments. Yeah.
Very good. So we have several questions from the audience. Let me ask the question that is on the chat box first before I turn this over to Randall, who is after that. So there's a question from the attendees. In the table of the bank relationship, why is it that you're controlling for standalone time fixed effect rather than standalone times industry times time fixed effect? Is that a typo, or is that actually you're not controlling for the industry?
So this is not a typo, not controlling for the industry, because the sample in this particular set becomes quite small. So I do not have the banking relationship of all the firms. So I cannot do a tighter specification, which all my tests have, where I can look at the variation in organizational structure within the state, within the industry, within the year. So the data restriction prevents me to look at standalone industry year fixed effects as well.
All right, very good. So I think we have multiple questions from the audience. So I think it would be best to just collect the questions first, and then you can respond to all of them, right? So Randall first, and then Rick, and then Ron, and I'm guessing Stefan and Bernie also have questions, but Randall first.
Okay, so I really like this paper. I think the idea of looking at elections is very good. It does resonate with papers on other things. So there's quite a big literature in Japan on business groups like this and their relationships with banks and political aspects of it. And so there is similar stuff. What that literature shows is that the banks are largely interested in the banks. And so what they're doing with these groups is they're trying to encourage group firms that might be in trouble to help bail out other group firms. Now that makes sense in Japan. You're sort of engaging in a kind of a corporate socialism. But in India, where you've got families, where these really aren't conglomerates, and I'd encourage you not to use the word conglomerate, because a conglomerate is a single corporation that has operations in multiple industries. What you're looking at is business groups. And business groups in countries like India are family controlled and pyramidal. And so you would expect to have the kind of tunneling in the Bertrand paper that you cite going on, and you'd expect to have directions to the tunneling rather than just kind of everybody helping everybody else out, as in Japan. So the directions would seem to be important. The other thing is that the political instability stuff kind of resonates with things that like Ray Fisman has done on Indonesia, where it's not so much an election, it's the prospect of a change in political power. So the family invests in connections with the politicians in that state. And as long as the politicians are still in power, they can connect with local people in the banks, because the banks are very tightly connected with the government in many of these countries. In India, they're state-owned enterprises mostly, I believe. And so then the problem will be, if there's a new set of government officials that come in, then all of that capital is lost, that connection capital, and you have to start all over again. Whereas if the old guys are reelected, then things should bounce back for the business group. And so it would be very interesting to see if you can find that opposition victories are more expensive for business groups than incumbent victories. What you're doing with the instability with the standalones makes perfect sense, though. I think that's a very good idea. So I'll sign off and wait for your comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Randall. Rick?
Yeah, I had just two thoughts or comments. So your main figure that you showed, where you show that the standalones have a negative effect, but the conglomerates do not. That, and this brings back to what Sumit was saying, that suggests that there is shrinkage in credit if the conglomerates are not getting not reducing their loans, and you also do a lot of things to suggest that it's a supply side story. So I wonder if you should look at what's going on the bank's balance sheets, or is there some reason from the bank side as to why they are shrinking credit? And when they are shrinking credit, they might give first priority for whatever reasons to the family business group firms, because they have a relationship not just with that particular firm, but with many other firms or with the family itself. And so the first sort of set of firms, when they shrink credit, is the standalone firms who lose out when the banks are trying to shrink credit. So what I'm missing out is the supply side effect coming simply because the banks are holding back on cash and choosing not to lend, or are they also getting some sort of a shock where they need to shrink credit and then they're prioritizing the family business group firms compared to this? So that is one of the things I'm sort of not totally clear on. The other thing is, what, as Sumit said, there could be some complicated political economy game going on where the banks might be helping out the firms, where the firms are helping out the political parties, and so on and so forth. This we might expect slightly differential effect between private and public banks, and one might be able to use that to figure out either say there is evidence or there is no evidence of that going on.
Thanks, Rick. Ron?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting paper. I had just a couple of thoughts of how you might do some other types of cross-sectional tests. In particular, your standalone firms may not be all that homogeneous. I mean, there could be certain subsample that have deep pockets because they're family-owned and the families are quite wealthy. Another type of heterogeneity that I would think about is differences in political connections at the state level. And that kind of ties into Rick's last comment that state-owned banks may be acting quite differently from private banks. And if you've got good political connections, you may still have access to state bank funding. But I think it's quite a fascinating paper. Thanks.
Okay, so I think just throw in my comment here because it's related to Ron's. You're looking at the number of relationship, but that is likely to be related with the size of the firm, related to the political connections of the firm. So I think that thing seems to capture a lot. The number of relationship may not be just the relationship with the bank. It could be a relationship with other stakeholders in the state. So I think you need to be careful with that variable. At least you need control for size and other things in the interactions, right? You need to interact size with those other things as well. Stefan seems to be next, and then Bernie.
Hi, so I also really enjoyed the paper. I'm wondering how good the data is, like the data on firm structure is in the time series. So could one study whether firm structure changes in the presence of these shocks? And so particularly it seems like standalones suffer in the presence of uncertainty. So are they more likely to become parts of business groups, or is there no movement in that direction whatsoever? The other outcome, I guess, is death. Like, are standalone firms more likely to basically disappear from the data set? For lack of a better opposite of survive, I call it death, I guess.
Bernie?
Yeah. Hi, thank you. I also enjoyed the paper, and it's fun to see all this micro empirical results. I want to make two comments. One is that I would suggest the author to pay attention to a very large literature that's in existence. For example, there are two JEL papers on business groups and so on. Then also there exists a huge set of papers by people like Krishna Panibu and Tarun Khanna on this internal markets and so on. It would be quite useful to go and connect with the huge literature. Oh, by the way, including Ron's really wonderful survey paper on pyramids and groups and internal markets and so on, so as to put your result in a larger context. The second thing is that I agree with Sumit. We have to think about what really this is about. What is the difference between the groups and the standalone firms in dealing with political uncertainty? And I think it's really not just about an election, but it's all the huge political economy set up. The groups and the standalone firms have different transactions costs, bargaining powers, and ability to set up credibility, to set up credible bargaining commitments, between the groups and the standalone. And like Randall and I have written in our JEL to talk about how they differ and why the business groups are more able to have stable bargaining outcome with the politicians. So if that is the case, then the elections would have much less impact on them. But it put your result into a different perspective. It's really about not just the political uncertainty, but it's really about the political economy system in India. And it's also related to, and I'll bring this to the Hector Amida and Daniel Wolfenson's work on, the difference between the internal market and the external market when you have a very weak capital market. So the discussions, they have a journal finance paper about that. And I think that paper speaks to your result. You may want to get connected with it. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Bernie. So just very last comment from me. I think what Bernie is describing, this is similar to I think what Adar has asked, is a question of is it coming from supply or is it coming from demand? It could be coming from demand. And the problem is that because you're doing a triple diff or a double diff, it's really tough to distinguish between supply and demand. So you have to play around with the heterogeneity on both the supply side and the demand side. And I think one heterogeneity that is being pointed out here is the banking system itself, right? How competitive is the banking sector in the state? I think that's another question that seemed to be useful for your identification. I'll let you answer to the comments. There are many of them, so please take your time, Arko.
Thank you for all the comments, and it's really great to receive such feedback. So first, I'll take it up shortly. I will provide brief answers. And first, to answer Randall's comment about investments in connections and states, and like that, there are more conglomerates are more connected. So just of course, like there is more connection that conglomerates have with the politicians. Just one thing that I would want to point out, that much of the benefits of connections are reaped after elections. So after elections, when your favorite political party whom you're supporting wins, one would expect much of the benefit to come out after the elections are done, and less so just before the elections. And primarily, again, when there is more uncertain elections versus less uncertain elections. So if it would be a story of just political cycle and connections, you wouldn't have seen a heterogeneous effect coming primarily from elections that are more uncertain versus elections that are less uncertain. But having said that, conglomerates, the way that they would benefit when an incumbent wins versus incumbent loses would certainly be an interesting thing to check. I do see that the effect is not different before elections, which results to incumbent winning and losing, but I can definitely dig more deep over there and look into what was suggested to me. And with Rick's comments about banks' balance sheet, I definitely have to look into from the banks' supply side or their balance sheet per se. So one thing I wanted to highlight in terms of private versus public banks. So what I have done is I have collected data, like a balance sheet data from one private bank in India. And I do find the same effect that I find in the larger, like a group of like overall results. I find the same effect that is coming from this one particular private bank that I have data from, and the same effect is reflected in their balance sheet as well, or their report that they provide. And I find, so that provides me some evidence that the effect is not driven only by the public banks, which typically tend to be more connected. So yeah, and regarding Ron's point about there definitely could be more cross sections that I can try and check in terms of subsample having different deep pockets and standalones that have more money and so on, and I can definitely do that. And the difference in political connections, I would definitely like to do that, but the only thing is that there is some form of data restrictions, I can try to find different proxies in terms of there are a lot of connection that happens because of like subgroup like castes or religion affiliations, which I can use as a proxy for political connections and work on that. And yeah, definitely, but it's very helpful. I can do that. And Johan, your point about the number of relationship, yeah, that definitely can vary with the size. I do take size as controls, but I can do another interactions, or like many of my results go through when I take size decile cross time fixed effects, which are comparing within size deciles. But yeah, I can use that in the results as well. And Stefan had a point about firm structure changing over time. I particularly tried to like abstract from this because the change in firm structure could be affected by a number of factors, of which one could be political uncertainty. So the way that I define my sample is that I keep conglomerates defined as those firms which continue to remain conglomerate from the start to the end of the sample, and a standalone which continues to remain standalone from the start to the end of the sample, just to avoid the thing that there could be switches that could be in anticipation of political uncertainty, and that can be a problem in terms of my identification. And the other comments by Bernie about relating to a larger literature, that's very helpful, and I'll definitely go ahead and try to link that more. With my purpose so far was try and link it to the literature in the sense that there has been costs and benefits, and as Sumit had also pointed out, I wanted to highlight such events or such instances when this particular uncertainty events are providing some form of brighter side of being a part of a larger conglomerate. But I can definitely think more in how to connect it more carefully to the literature. And just last one point about connecting with this literature in Japan, that's actually, I was thinking of putting that down very explicitly in the paper, and that was exactly the point that Randall had suggested, that Japan, the nature of the economy is so different that you would expect some form of help being done within the conglomerates, while in India, because of this business group structure, the incentives and the dynamics could be much different. And I'll definitely change it to business group per se, and probably not conglomerates, not use the word conglomerates that much. That would be my response.
I would urge you to take Sumit's point very seriously.
Yeah.
What we have here, this election is not a one shot, it's a repeated game. It's the same group of players again and again playing with the business group and the standalone firm. And and you have to look at this in that equilibrium and ask the question, what are you picking up from that equilibrium?
Sure. So just one response, like building relationship, like there are papers on relationship building that have also highlighted there are some constraint in which how many relationship or how easy is it to build a relationship with with banks and the firm. So there might be some constraints there, and I can exploit some of those constraints in itself to answer to that question, that why aren't firms anticipating this and building an equilibrium of very high number of relationships just to hedge this uncertainty. But there are existing literature that have talked about bottlenecks in relationship formation. I can fall back on those and use that to provide a sharper test in saying that in those particular cases where relationship building is difficult, one would expect the results to be stronger.
All right. Thank you, Arko. Thank you, Sumit, and thank you, the audience. It was a very lively discussion. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
We will take a 10-minute break. We'll start again at 11 o'clock when we're going to talk about papers about IPOs in China. All right. So, or non-IPOs in China. So, all right. We'll see you all back in 10 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, on the political stuff that you were talking about, I think that there's a supply and demand issue there too, right? So you might think that the families are helping the politicians, and then after the election, the politicians will reward the families.
Yes.
But it could easily be the other way around, right? It could be that the politicians are helping the families before the elections. The families then make sure that the politicians win, get back in. And exactly which way that power balance goes depends a lot on kind of how corrupt the elections are, how important money is in the elections, how important it is to lean on the TV networks or the radio stations. Are they part of the group? Does the group control the media in this state? So the power relationship in other countries is very different from the way political patronage would work in the US, where there's kind of a much simpler thing before and after the election. So I'd be a little bit worried about just assuming that it's going to work like US corruption.
Randall, can I just build on your point? In fact, in India, I mean, this will be rather tedious for you to document, Arko, but I know where they have this big set of brothers or families. One of them is a politician. So literally they are standing for election and the whole family is trying to make sure they get reelected, mainly exactly the way you're thinking, Randall. And so, I mean, this is well known in India that, and they do it, they make sure one is politician to protect the interest of the conglomerate or the family business.
Yeah. And in fact, I didn't, the last time I was in India, I didn't check that this was still there, but like 10 years ago when I was there, they took me on a tour around New Delhi and showed me the Tata Embassy and the Birla Embassy, where the Tata Business Group has this huge building that's all full of lobbyists whose job is to go around and influence whoever the government needs to be influenced. And the Birla had the same thing at the time. I don't know if liberalization has eased that up. But an independent firm out in Assam or in Kerala just doesn't have that same influence. And the banks, especially being that the banks are state-owned, I believe they still are, aren't they? Then government is perhaps more important than banker influence.
Can I just have one answer to that? Like, so broadly, I don't want to say that the results are not driven by political connections. If the value of political connections for the conglomerate firms are high during periods of uncertainty, that is very much in line with what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying that political connection is not driving the result. Political connection can definitely be one of the channel through which conglomerates are protecting themselves or they're hedging themselves. It's just that I cannot identify this channel separately. But the thing that would go against my story is that it has nothing to do with uncertainty. It has nothing to do with elections. It's just political connections. So that would go against my story. But
the point is that politicians are in the market and they affect the working of the business world. And the business groups and the politicians can form a stable collusion. Because they have, I mean, the groups are multifaceted. They can bargain with the politicians or the class of politicians with more credibility. Like Michael Winston would have a model about this kind of thing, and also because they have also longer credibility. I mean, the standalone firms would have shorter lifespan than the business groups. So in other words, the business groups, compared to standalone firms, can form a stable, credible bargaining relationship and outcome with the class of politicians. And that's part one of what you have. Part two of what you have is that what they're doing here can affect the development of the capital market and affect the allocation of resources. And so there is another distortion of this thing, and I think your results are speaking to those kind of conceptualization in the literature.
Sure.
Yeah, that's what makes your paper really interesting.
Yeah. So both these points are in line with what I find, and if it would be possible for me to exactly show this in itself, I would be very happy. It would make my paper more rich in terms of that this is exactly what's going on. But again, like this, of course, like conglomerate firms are more stable. They have an established relationship. And what I'm saying is that possibly this is what is allowing them to hedge this particular uncertainties. And And it's not just election cycles. It's the uncertain elections that these particular relationships or this stability in their performances is giving them some benefits. And this could come from the fact that banks now consider them less risky during these periods of uncertainty. And that is what I'm trying to highlight, that banks can either consider them less risky because they have a stable operation, or they have a stable relationship with the political disposition. And when they come to power, they can get all the benefits and banks can get back their money.
Or the banks aren't even thinking about risk. The banks have received orders from the politicians to lend to these guys.
That could as well be, but like there's one question from Rick who had suggested to look at private versus public, and I have one data from private bank where I see that effect as well. So I'm not claiming that private banks are God's gift to mankind and they have no connections at all, but so this unlikely to be.
May I interrupt for a second? I would like to let Tianyu test her slides. We can continue talking. Just so that you're not surprised.
Okay.
Bernie, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay.
So I think the point is that this is not concentrated or solely based in India, because you can think of the Medici popes, right? This has been going around forever. Business groups and politicians and whoever has power. And so I think it's a very interesting phenomenon.
I think there's a possibility that you divide up the different provinces or different states in India. I think that the state-owned banks are more prominent in some locations than other. I wonder if you can use that heterogeneity to show that there's a variation in results.
Yeah, I could do that, but like a huge amount of lending in India is done by the state-owned banks in itself. So in most locations which are not the city centers, like say major metropolitans, the maximum lending will come from the state-owned banks, and it is there probably where I could see the difference more salient. And just for one clarification, I do not have the Tatas and Birlas of the world in my samples. I dropped the top 10% of the big conglomerate. I don't even think that Tata cares about a state election, or Birla would care about a state election.
You might be right.
Yeah.
One thing you might think about, though, is also the policies of the state governments, especially the ones that suddenly upset the old government. So in Latin America, there's work shows that when liberalizing reformers come in, and reduce tariffs and reduce government subsidies and things like that, the groups shrink.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Oh, that I also could do, because there are some states that had more governments more on the left of the political spectrum had come on, and what that had done. So I had done some tests with regards to your first suggestion about incumbents winning or incumbents losing. It's just that I had done in the previous year before elections, saying that if the incumbents win, the uncertainty is lesser, like the expectation that the incumbent win versus the expectation that there's an entrant coming. And I find similar results there, but I get your point that the more interesting would be what happens after the elections when, say, an incumbent keeps their position while there's a change in the political party.
Right, yeah, and it's not so much left versus right, it's liberalization versus statism. So you could have right-wing that are still very...
Sure. But by left, right, I meant more market-friendly versus more constrained in that sense. Yeah, not like,
Sure.
Yeah. But thank you for the comment.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Anyway, congratulations. It's a very nice paper.
Thank you.
I think you'll get it published in a good place.
Thank you.
I'll sign off now to get
Thank you.